In the winter of 1933, on a wind-scoured basin in eastern New Mexico, a young archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania knelt in the gravel and lifted a single fluted stone point from beside the rib of a mammoth. His name was Edgar Billings Howard. The point was slender, grooved down the center, unmistakably made by human hands, and it lay against the bones of an animal extinct for 10,000 years. Howard understood what he was holding. Not a curiosity, a boundary. It said something the science of his day was not ready to accept, that people had been in the Americas long enough to hunt animals no living person had ever seen. Over 4 years, his team pulled a story from that gravel, and from it a wall was built around the American past. What no one in that gravel pit could know was that the wall would take nearly a century to crack, and that when it did, it would crack not in New Mexico but at both ends of 2 continents at once, a sandstone shelter in Pennsylvania and a peat bog at the bottom of the world, with a silence between them no one could explain. Who came before the wall? How far back does the human story on this land really reach? Why did the evidence keep arriving from the wrong places, in the wrong order? And what happens to a story when the ground itself refuses to agree with it? To understand the wall, you must understand how tidy it was. By the middle of the 20th century, the account had hardened into something close to law. During the last ice age, humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska over a land bridge exposed by low seas. They waited, blocked by immense ice sheets, until a corridor opened through Canada around 13,000 years ago. Then they poured south, carrying the fluted point Howard had found, and became the first Americans. The culture was named Clovis, after the New Mexico town near his dig. One route, one people, one front door in the northwest. It was elegant and teachable, and for decades nothing was permitted to be older. The story became the ground every archaeologist stood on. To question it was to say the ground itself was wrong. The first serious crack did not come from a grand expedition, it came from a groundhog. In the autumn of 1955, a farmer named Albert Miller was walking his land in Washington County, in southwestern Pennsylvania. Beneath a sandstone overhang above a stream called Cross Creek, he noticed something scattered around a groundhog's burrow. Burnt bone, flakes of flint, and a little deeper, an intact flint knife. He kept it quiet, afraid of looters, and spent 18 years searching for a professional careful enough to excavate it properly. That professional arrived in 1973. His name was James Adivasio, and he approached the shelter now called Meadowcroft, the slow way. His team peeled the site apart in thin, controlled slices, mapping every flake, every fleck of charcoal, every fragment of bone, and near the bottom, in the deepest cultural layers, they found the debris of people making things with their hands. When the charcoal was dated in 1974, the first radiocarbon results came back from the Smithsonian and stunned everyone who saw them. The deepest material pushed back towards 16,000 years, thousands of years before Clovis, and in entirely the wrong place, far from the corridor's exit, deep in the eastern woodlands where nothing was supposed to be old at all. The field's first answer came almost immediately. Contamination. The objection was not foolish. The region around Meadowcroft sits on coal, and in theory groundwater moving through it could carry old carbon into the samples and make them read older than they were. That deserved to be checked, and it was, again and again. The leading defender of the old model, a geoarchaeologist named C. Vance Haynes, pressed hard on the dates through the 1980s and beyond, wanting the smoking gun, the coal particle, the contaminated fiber, the proof the samples were dirty. It never showed up. Independent testing found no evidence that groundwater had disturbed the layers. The stratigraphy held. More than 50 consistent dates came out of that shelter, and later accelerator dating supported the earlier work rather than overturning it. Test the same layer again, and it would not cooperate. Adivasio was not simply reporting a number, he was telling a discipline its foundation was wrong. And a field built on Clovis first had a great deal riding on it. Textbooks, museum displays, careers. When a whole field agrees on a story, the story becomes the ground, and someone who says the ground is wrong feels less like a colleague than a threat. So the safer answer for years was that Meadowcroft was somehow flawed. There was no conspiracy, only something more stubborn, certainty protecting itself. You do not have to destroy inconvenient evidence. You only have to make the person carrying it look reckless until people stop citing the date, not because it was disproven, but because it became easier to avoid. And yet there is another record at Meadowcroft, running alongside the charcoal and the flint. The land above that shelter belonged, before European contact, to the people archaeologists call the Monongahela, and later to the Lenape, the Shawnee, the neighbours of the Haudenosaunee. Their descendants have long held that their roots here do not begin with any migration a textbook can draw. According to their accounts, the people were always here. And here is the detail that unsettles the tidy version. Even the archaeologists cannot say whether the earliest people at Meadowcroft were the direct ancestors of the Lenape and the Shawnee, or a different people entirely, one whose name has not survived. The written record cannot close that gap. The oral tradition steps into it. Some traditions speak of ones who came before the remembered ancestors, a first people already old when the remembered story began. Such accounts cannot be verified the way a date can. But over a sealed layer no textbook could explain, the distance between the two kinds of memory begins to feel very thin. One strange sight can be set aside. But Meadowcroft was not alone for long. Follow the land south, into Virginia, to Cactus Hill on the sandy banks of the Nottoway River. Here, in the 1990s, excavators led by Joseph McAvoy dug down through a Clovis layer and kept going. Below it, separated by a band of sterile sand, they found more stone tools, blades, cores, the earliest sand tested to more than 18,000 years. Below Clovis means before Clovis, and stratigraphy does not lie about order. Critics answered that in sandy soil artifacts might have slipped downward, but soil scientists and luminescence dating suggested the layers were largely intact. Each site was picked apart on its own. Meadowcroft had its coal, Cactus Hill its sand. In isolation, each objection sounded reasonable. The trouble was the pattern. When Pennsylvania and Virginia independently pointed past the same wall, the explanations began to feel like labor spent defending a conclusion rather than testing it. And then the evidence stopped being tools at all. It became footsteps. Travel southwest to White Sands National Park in New Mexico, a basin of blinding gypsum dunes over the bed of an ancient lake. In the old lakeshore mud, researchers found human footprints, fossilized, pressed into the ground by real feet, then buried and preserved. Adult prints and children's prints, a trackway of people crossing a wet Ice Age landscape, and in places those tracks ran beside the tracks of giant ground sloths, the great beasts that vanished at the end of the Ice Age, people and those animals on the same ground at the same time. Then the layers were dated, and the number stopped the breath. Not 13,000 years, not 16, between roughly 21 and 23,000 years, deep into the coldest peak of the last ice age, when the ice sheets stood at their height and the corridor was slammed shut. These people crossed New Mexico thousands of years before the front door was even supposed to exist. This is why footprints strike differently. A tool can be argued down through sand, a date can be debated, but a footprint is a person in a single moment, walking. You cannot claim it fell into an older layer. The foot pressed the mud when the mud was soft, and the mud was soft more than 20,000 years ago. The print outlasted the walker by all those millennia, carrying a message the walker never meant to send. The field tried anyway, aiming at the one soft spot. How was the date obtained? The original study dated seeds of an aquatic plant from the same layers, and water plants can absorb old carbon from the water around them, which can make them read older than they are. So perhaps, critics argued, the seeds were unreliable and the prints younger than they looked. So the researchers went back, and this time did not rely on the seeds alone. They dated pollen from land plants which do not carry the aquatic problem, and used a luminescence method with no carbon at all. Different materials, different clocks, and the answer returned in the same staggering window. Later work added still more samples until dozens of independent dates agreed. You can dismiss one technique. It is far harder to dismiss three that do not share the same weakness. By now the wall was not merely cracked. People were walking through the space where it had stood. And if all of this were only a North American story, it might still have been contained. It was not. Now travel as far south as the land goes, to a cold, wet stream bank in southern Chile called Monte Verde. If Meadowcroft was a problem, Monte Verde was worse, for a strange and beautiful reason: water. At most sites, wood rots and plants disintegrate, and all that survives is stone and bone. But Monte Verde was buried beneath a peat bog, and the waterlogged, oxygen-starved mud acted as a vault, keeping what almost never survives. The archaeologist Tom Dillehay and his team, working from the late 1970s onward, found worked wood, the remains of structures, seaweed carried up from the distant Pacific coast, even a fragment that appeared to be preserved hide. Not a scatter of ambiguous stones, but the soft, human texture of a living camp. And the dates came back around 14,500 years, older than Clovis, at the far bottom of 2 continents. Think about what that requires. If people were living in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they had not squeezed through a corridor at 13,000 and sprinted the length of the hemisphere. They were already there, at the far end of everything, before the front door was supposed to open. Distance became the new problem, and distance is much harder to blame on coal or sand. For years, Monte Verde drew the same treatment: doubt, skepticism, the suggestion that something was off. But the evidence was so rich and so carefully documented that in 1997 the field did something it rarely does: it went to look. A group of respected archaeologists, including hardened skeptics of pre-Clovis claims, traveled to Chile to examine the site in person, and most walked away convinced that it was real, that it was human, and that it was older than Clovis. For a discipline that had defended a hard wall for decades, this was as close to a public crack as it gets. And at the southern end of the world runs a second record too, beside the peat and the wood. The land around Monte Verde is the country of the Mapuche, and to the south the Huilliche, whose name means the people of the south. When Dillahay's researchers worked the site, they did something unusual. They sat with those living communities and listened to what the place meant to them, not as dead history, but as a past still lived into the present. The Mapuche and the Huilliche have long held that they did not arrive from somewhere else, that their origins lie in this land itself. And modern genetics adds a quiet note beneath that claim. Studies suggest the ancestors of these southern peoples separated from other lineages thousands of years ago and were not reached by the later waves from the north. Science does not call this proof of an origin story, but it does not erase it either. The written record and the spoken record, once again, stand very close together. If people were spread across 2 continents this early, how did they arrive? Why does the evidence keep surfacing at the edges, north and south, and so rarely in the tidy middle? And who were those first ones? Here the 2 threads, northern and southern, twine into one. Along the sealed layers of Meadowcroft, the peat of Monte Verde, and within the traditions of the peoples at both ends of the land runs the same shape of a story: ones who came before. A first people whose name did not survive, said in some accounts to have followed the edge of the water in a time before the waters rose, when the shoreline lay far beyond any coast we know now. It is oral tradition, not proven history, and must be held that way, gently. But it is hard to ignore that north and south, separated by 2 continents, seem to gesture toward the same vanished beginning. And the science, strangely, points toward that same water. The tidy single-file march through an inland corridor no longer works. The corridor opened too late to explain a camp at the bottom of Chile, so researchers turned to another way in, down the coast, along what is sometimes called the Kelp Highway. While the interior was choked with ice, the Pacific coastline may have offered a living route, rich with kelp forests, shellfish, seabirds and fish, a continuous ribbon of food running south along the shore. People hugging that coast could have moved from Alaska towards South America along the water's edge, skipping the frozen interior. It explains the timing and how Monte Verde could be so old and so far south, but it comes with a devastating catch. At the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were far lower than today. The ancient coastline those first travelers would have walked is now underwater, drowned when the glaciers melted. The camps, the hearths, the tools, the footprints, if they existed, sit beneath the water off the modern shore. And think what that does to the argument. For decades, inland archaeologists searched the interior, found little older than Clovis, and took that absence as proof. But if the first people walked a coastline that no longer exists above water, then the interior was always the wrong place to look. The silence was never proof of absence. It was proof that the digging was happening in the wrong dirt. Before the honest accounting, one more claim sits at the far edge. In Southern California, during a highway project, workers uncovered the bones of a mastodon. Some researchers, led by Steve Holan and the paleontologist Tom DeMary, argued the bones had been broken in a fresh, deliberate pattern, as if smashed for marrow, with heavy stones nearby they read as hammers and anvils. The date they proposed was not 13,000 years, but around 130,000. Honesty requires clarity. Most researchers reject this interpretation. The mainstream view is that natural forces or heavy equipment broke those bones and the stones were simply stones. There is no accepted body of other sites supporting a human presence that early. This is not proven. By any fair reading, it is a fringe claim, and the caution around it is justified. So why raise it? Because of what it reveals about the debate. A generation earlier, saying humans were here 16,000 years ago made a person a target. Now a claim 10 times older could be published in a major journal and argued on its merits. Once the wall began to move, the argument lost its ceiling. So let the record be separated cleanly, because this story is dramatic enough without bending. What is established? Multiple sites now show human presence before Clovis. Monte Verde is widely accepted. The White Sands footprints, backed by several independent methods, place people here deep in the Ice Age. Pre-Clovis is no longer the fringe, it is the new baseline. What remains genuinely debated, the exact routes, some specific dates, the full timing of a coastal migration. Even Monte Verde has lately returned to discussion, with a recent study questioning whether it is as old as long believed, a reminder that here even settled ground can shift again. And what is speculation? The far edge, the 100,000-year claims, rejected by most and unsupported by any pattern of sites. Now return to that overhang in Pennsylvania, where this began. Those inconvenient dates a generation of critics tried so hard to explain away were never overturned. The shelter is still there, the layers are still there, and the deep dates still sit in the record, having outlasted many who insisted they had to be wrong. Clovis first did not die in a single dramatic moment. There was no press conference, no apology. It retreated quietly, in softer textbook language, in diagrams that added a coastal arrow, in museum labels rewritten to say one of the early cultures instead of the first. The old map did not burn. It simply changed shape and hoped no one would notice how hard it had fought to stay the same. And the deepest question is still open. If the real evidence lies beneath the water, along a coastline we cannot easily reach, how much of the first American story are we still missing? History is not a solved equation. It is an incomplete puzzle, and some of its most important pieces may rest in the dark under the Pacific, holding the beginning of a story we only began to believe when the ground itself forced us to. Picture that sealed layer in the Pennsylvania cliff at dusk, one old date the field spent decades trying to erase. And far to the south, beneath the peat, a camp that should not have existed. Between them, two continents and a silence that still has not been explained. And somewhere off the coast, under the cold water, an ancient shoreline where the rest may still be waiting for us to admit it was there all along. Thank you for watching. If stories like this move you, where the record and the memory of a people are given equal weight, and the mystery is allowed to remain a mystery, consider subscribing so the next investigation can find you. And before you go, sit with the question at the center of all this. If the oldest chapter of the human story on these two continents lies drowned beneath a risen sea, remembered only in the traditions of the people who never left, then who were the first ones, and what did they know that we are only now beginning to imagine? I'll see you in the next documentary.